May 1943. The Atlantic was black glass under a moonless sky, and U-552 cut through it like a steel ghost. Kapitänleutnant Erich Topp stood on the bridge, his face lit only by the pale glow of his wrist compass. The sea was calm, unnervingly calm. For months now, something in the Atlantic had changed. Convoys were better protected, aircraft appeared faster, and the hunters were becoming the hunted. But tonight, the ocean was silent, and silence was good. Silence meant survival. Then he heard it, a sound faint and alien, seeping through the static of the Metox receiver, a rapid electronic pulse. It wasn't Morse, it wasn't radio chatter, it was something else, something that shouldn't exist. He adjusted the knobs, but the pulse vanished as quickly as it came. Moments later, one of the lookouts shouted, "Aircraft!" A white flare cracked open the darkness. Topp's instincts took over. Alarm! Dive! 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 The klaxon screamed, and the men scrambled down the conning tower. The boat plunged beneath the surface just as bombs tore the water above into fire and steel. The shock waves slammed through the hull. Lights flickered, gauges rattled, and the crew waited for the sound every submariner dreaded, the shriek of a crack in the pressure hull. But it didn't come. When the last echo faded, only the throb of the diesels and the labored breathing of 50 men remained. U-552 had survived, but Topp knew this was no accident. The aircraft had come straight for them, as if guided by an invisible hand. Something had changed in the war at sea, and he could feel it in his bones. For the next 3 days, Topp prowled submerged, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries. Each night, the same strange pulse returned, like the heartbeat of a machine, pulsing from the sky. Each night, aircraft appeared with uncanny precision, forcing him under again and again. It was as if the Allies could see through the ocean itself. On the third night, his nerves raw from exhaustion, Topp gave up trying to make sense of it. He ordered, "Surface for air." The boat rose. Hatches opened, and the men breathed the freezing Atlantic wind. The sea was empty, the stars bright, and for a few precious minutes, peace returned. Then came the searchlight. A beam of white light carved across the sea like a sword, locking on to the conning tower. Topp froze. A British Leigh light. He'd heard the rumors. Aircraft now carried searchlights to catch U-boats on the surface at night, something once unthinkable. Alarm! Dive! 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 The boat dove again, but the bombs followed. This time the sea didn't spare them. The depth charges rolled down like thunder, and the pressure waves slammed into U-552. Pipes burst, bulbs shattered, and the lights went out. Men were thrown from their stations. In the pitch dark, Topp's voice echoed, steady but strained. Hold depth, emergency repairs. They survived again, but barely. The next morning, the destroyers came. Sonar pings bounced off their hull, methodical and relentless. Each ping was a death sentence delayed by seconds. They lay silent, motionless, listening to the enemy circle above like wolves. Hours passed. The oxygen thinned. Sweat dripped from faces pale with carbon dioxide buildup. Finally, Topp made his choice. "Surface," he whispered. "We'll fight on the surface." When the U-boat broke through the waves, the destroyer was waiting. The sea exploded in tracer fire. Shells ripped through the conning tower, tearing apart the periscope housing. Topp shouted for his men to abandon ship, and as they leapt into the Atlantic, the submarine that had once been his pride, the Red Devil of the Atlantic, slid beneath the waves forever. Topp survived. He was pulled from the water by the same destroyer that had hunted him. For him, the war at sea was over, but for the rest of the U-boat arm, the nightmare had only just begun.
In Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz could not understand what was happening. In the first 2 weeks of May 1943, 43 U-boats had vanished. Entire wolf packs were being annihilated. Convoys that once scattered in panic were now gliding safely across the Atlantic. Radio reports from surviving boats spoke of aircraft appearing out of nowhere, of being spotted in total darkness, of the enemy always knowing their position. Dönitz suspected a leak. Perhaps the Allies had cracked Enigma again. But B-Dienst, the German code-breaking branch, swore their systems were secure. Something else was at play. In the darkened corridors of the Allied command, the truth was simple and devastating: centimetric radar. Until now, the U-boats had feared only long-wave radar, signals detectable by their METOX receivers. When a British patrol sent out radar waves around 1.5 meters, METOX could hear it, a faint whine that warned commanders to dive before the aircraft arrived. But in early 1943, British scientists had perfected a new technology using the cavity magnetron, a device capable of generating microwaves with wavelengths as short as 10 centimeters. It was a revolution in physics and war. At such short wavelengths, radar beams could detect the smallest periscope tip or comming tower even in heavy seas, and METOX, tuned to much longer waves, was deaf to it. The Allies had become invisible to the hunters. The first aircraft fitted with this new radar, the Vickers Wellington and later the Liberator, could now sweep the ocean like gods from the sky. Submarines, once masters of stealth, were being tracked and destroyed before they even saw the enemy. By mid-May, Dönitz had to face reality. "The Battle of the Atlantic," he said in a grim meeting with his staff, "is lost if we do not find a countermeasure." But none existed. Germany's best scientists worked night and day trying to create a receiver for the new radar frequencies. They called it Naxos, a desperate attempt to catch up. But for months, the U-boats were blind. Every night, more boats failed to report in. U-boat crews began to call it Der Schwarze Mai, Black May. In a single month, 118 U-boats had gone to sea. 41 never returned. The Allied losses, once counted in dozens of ships per week, dropped to near zero. Convoy escorts and aircraft worked in perfect coordination, their radar screens lighting up with the ghosts of submarines they could now see with eerie clarity. The hunters had become the hunted. One night in the Bay of Biscay, U-333 under Kapitänleutnant Peter Erich Kramer was heading home after a brutal patrol. His crew was exhausted, his batteries nearly drained. The sky was overcast, good cover for a surface run. But shortly before midnight, a faint reflection appeared on an RAF Liberator's radar screen. The operator marked it and called out, "Contact, bearing 270, range 7 miles." The pilot turned toward the blip, throttles wide open. Within minutes, the dark Atlantic exploded into light as the aircraft's lee light switched on. The crew of U-333 barely had time to react before depth charges fell. The explosions tore through the hull, killing men instantly. Kramer survived by sheer luck, blown overboard by the blast. He watched as his submarine split and sank, dragging his friends into the abyss. He later said, "It was as if the sky had eyes." In a sense, it did. The Allies had built a network of radar-equipped aircraft and ships that made the Atlantic transparent. The once endless ocean where U-boats could vanish had become a deadly trap. Even neutral waters were no refuge. In the Bay of Biscay, long-range Liberators prowled day and night. Coastal Command, once mocked as the Cinderella service of the RAF, had become the executioner of the U-boat fleet. The Germans tried painting their boats with radar-absorbing materials, tried towing decoys, even tried sailing submerged all the way home. Nothing worked. For the first time, Dönitz began to withdraw boats from the Atlantic. He admitted, "Our losses are unsustainable." The wolf packs that once terrorized convoys were now shadows of themselves. The ocean, once their domain, belonged to the Allies. And at the heart of it all was a 10-centimeter wave, a frequency too short for the Germans to detect, too perfect for them to fight.
Meanwhile, in Britain, a quiet group of physicists and engineers watched the results of their invention unfold. The cavity magnetron had been developed in secrecy at the University of Birmingham, perfected by scientists like John Randall and Harry Boot. When they first showed it to the Americans, it was said to be worth 1,000 bombers. It allowed radar sets to be small, powerful, and precise, able to fit into aircraft, ships, even torpedoes. At RAF bases across England, crews learned to trust their new radar. Pilots could now spot the faint echo of a periscope against the clutter of waves. They would swoop down in total darkness, guided by nothing but that green blip on the screen, and unleash death on a target that had no idea it was even being watched. One such mission came on May 23, 1943. An RAF Wellington, flying out of Cornwall, picked up a return at 8 miles. The operator kept his eyes on the scope, whispering course corrections. Steady, steady, target confirmed. The pilot descended to 200 feet, switched on the Leigh light, and there it was, U-753, caught mid-surfacing, its crew frozen in shock. The depth charges hit seconds later. The explosion broke the boat in two. All hands were lost. That night, the crew back at base marked another victory on the board. They didn't know it, but that same week, Dönitz had already ordered a temporary halt to Atlantic operations. The U-boat arm was bleeding to death. Back in Germany, scientists raced to understand the mystery. They tore apart captured Allied radar sets, analyzed their frequencies, and finally realized the truth: centimetric wavelengths. When they heard it, some refused to believe. It was so advanced, it seemed like magic. But by the time the Germans produced the Naxos radar detector in late 1943, the damage was done. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned irreversibly in favor of the Allies. Supplies, fuel, and men now flowed across the ocean to Britain without fear. The invasion of Normandy, the liberation of France, the final march on Berlin, all would depend on those lifelines. And they existed only because of a technology that allowed man to see beyond darkness. Erich Topp would survive the war. Captured and later repatriated, he became one of the few U-boat aces to live to old age. He never forgot the sound he heard that night, the pulse from the sky that changed everything. Years later, when asked what he thought in that moment, he said quietly, "We were fighting ghosts. We just didn't know it yet." The story of May 1943 is not one of heroism or vengeance. It is a story of science, a battle between innovation and tradition, between those who mastered the invisible and those who could not. For years, the U-boats had ruled the Atlantic through fear and stealth. But war evolves, and the Allies, driven by desperation, unlocked a realm the Germans could not see. In the span of weeks, the hunter became the hunted. The Atlantic turned from a graveyard for convoys into a graveyard for submarines, and the tide of World War II shifted forever. All because of a 10-centimeter wave, an invisible line between darkness and dawn.